So several of you said that you were interested in Isaiah. Several of you said that you tried reading Isaiah and had a hard time figuring out what Isaiah is about. And that is very, it's accurate. Isaiah is a tough book. I think it was Lindy who mentioned the church fathers that I talked about. So St. Augustine asked St. Ambrose, where should a Christian start in the Bible? And Ambrose said, Isaiah, to which St. Augustine, one of the most learned biblical scholars of the last 2,000 years, said, yeah, but it's kind of difficult. So if you think Isaiah is difficult, then you are in excellent company. But we're going to break it down a little bit. I'm going to run this forum a little different as I've done in forums past. I'm not going to do little videos and show them. For me to do a video on all 66 chapters of Isaiah, I would need to quit my full-time job and just do this. So we're going to do this kind of live, and each night, except for tonight, each night we're going to take a chunk of Isaiah, and I'm going to sort of go through it and pick out the key highlights. We'll see if there's any questions or any further highlights anyone else wants to pick out. And then I'm going to take a section, it might be 5 verses, it might be 10 verses or so. And then together we are, and I'm going to lean a lot on you, it's when I'm going to sort of shut my mouth, allow you all to interpret, given what you will have learned about Isaiah up to that point. So I'm hoping this will be very hands-on. I want to, two things I want to do tonight. I want to give a basic primer on biblical studies and what that might look like and how you might begin to approach a book to wonder what it's trying to say. And then I'm going to give a basic primer on the history that the prophet Isaiah was working in. And there will be some names and dates and places. I do not expect you to absorb and memorize every name, date, or place, but Isaiah is a book that is very tied to the history. He was a prophet to the kings of Judah, and so he was dealing with the people whose names we know. And so I hope by the end of this, they aren't just names, but you'll feel like you know who they are, and they won't just be Charlton Heston. So whenever we look at biblical studies, we have a text, and our text now is the book of the prophet Isaiah, but it could be Revelation, it could be Psalm 23, Genesis chapter 3, whatever it is we happen to be look at, there is a text. And within that text, we should somehow be able to glean what God was saying there, what God was saying, what God was doing in the action of the text, and then what God was saying when God had people write it down, what God was saying to the original audience. And that is going to be intimately tied with what was going on in the world. And it doesn't matter what text we're looking at, it's almost always going to be tied with what's going on. It could be what's going on sociologically at the time. It could be what was going on historically. It could be what was going on personally in the life of the author or the person or persons that it was being written to. But there was something going on, and God was speaking into whatever that was. On Monday, both of my kids are in dance, and they're in a dance company about 15 minutes away in Sterling. And Monday night, we got a call from my oldest daughter, Zoe, that she forgot her shoes. And so I had to drive out her shoes. So there was a half hour in the car. On Tuesday night, I packed up my daughter Maddie's dinner, set it on the table, and she forgot it. So then she called and said she forgot her dinner. Can I bring her dinner out? And then this morning, my wife called, and her office is not far from the dance studio. And she said that she needed me to bring something. And when she said that, when she asked me to bring something, there was an implicit recognition that I had already made special trips on Monday and Tuesday nights. And so what she was saying was tied in with what was going on. And of course, I drove it out to her. But when we're looking at the Bible, this is what we're looking at. Now, if we just stopped there, then that would be perhaps interesting to some. It would be interesting historically, right? Like, oh, it's interesting to know what God was doing a long time ago to people who lived in a place we can't even imagine. But it wouldn't have much relevance today. And so the other part of biblical studies is to look at what God is saying. What is God saying today? We believe that God spoke in ages past. We also believe that God is still speaking, and that God is still speaking through this text. And what God is saying today is going to be intimately tied in with what's going on today, sociologically, politically, economically, militarily, personally, emotionally. I was terrible in math. My constant joke is that I went to the seminary because there were no math requirements. There are 10 commandments and 12 disciples, and that's it. But I do remember when you needed to solve for X. And so if you had 8 over X and 6 over 15, and you needed to solve for X, you would do the cross multiply and divide. So you divide multiply 8 times 15, you get 120, divide by 6. And so it's 20. Those two parts of the equation, two sides of the equation are needed. It's the same when I think about looking at the scriptures. The scriptures are not just an interesting historical look-see into the past, but that also into what God is saying today. That's part of what I think what we mean when we say that the Bible is holy. If you have a copy of the Bible, chances are it says Holy Bible on the front of it. And for me, I don't think it's holy just because we might say everything in it happened, that it's historically accurate. I don't think its holiness ends there. My kids take history, and hopefully everything in their history textbooks happened. Hopefully everything in their textbooks are true. And if we could prove that everything in Maddie's history textbook was true, it wouldn't make it holy. I think what makes the Bible holy is that it still speaks. It spoke in ages past. It has spoken to every generation of at least the last 2,000 years, and we could probably say with the Old Testament the last 3,500 years, and God still speaks through it today. And so when we look at what God is saying today, we still have to go back and look at what was going on in the past, which is why I spend a lot of time in sermons going on here's what was going on linguistically, historically, politically at the time when this text was written, so that we can figure out what God's saying today. Does that make sense, everybody? Anybody want to push back, or I've stunned you into silence? Hopefully you're all still there.
Yep, Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Good idea.
Everyone's muted. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So here's what I want to do now is I want to go through the timeline, the history. I want to first, because I know many people, including me sometimes, wonder which came first. People, did Abraham come before David? Did Moses come before Jesus? I'm not quite sure how that works. So I want to just put Isaiah into the context of the entire biblical timeline. So over on, if I can maybe do this. The Bible obviously starts with the very familiar stories that many of us probably remember from Sunday school of creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the section of the Bible that we tend to call the primeval history. And then we go into the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives, and all of the sort of dysfunction and wonder that came out of those stories. Jacob's favorite son was Joseph, and he was so much the favorite that his 11 brothers beat him up and threw him in a pit and then sold him into slavery, and he ended up in Egypt. And then, of course, he ends up becoming the hero and saving the day. And so Pharaoh says, why don't you bring all your family over to Egypt? And so that's how Israel gets into Egypt. And for a while, they live like kings, but eventually they don't, and they get enslaved. And then we have the Exodus, and where God lights a bush on fire, tells Moses to go, tell Pharaoh, let my people go. They go out into the wilderness for 40 years. They come into the land that had been promised, their own land for the first time ever. They're not a vagabond people, but they have their own place. And when they get there, there is no central governing structure whatever. It's a loose confederation of 12 tribes. And we call this period the time of the judges. There are no kings. There is no central leader. There are, every once in a while, there would be a time of crisis, usually some other nation who was coming to with an army to kill a lot of them. And so a judge would arise, would sort of serve as a mini king for a while, get them through the crisis. And when the crisis was over, the judge, the mini king, would go back into obscurity. Eventually, the people say, we want a king. We want someone we can rally around. And so we get Samuel and Saul, and then we get King David and King Solomon, who hopefully we all remember. And right after King Solomon, the kingdom divides. So this is a map of what Israel would have looked like around the time of King David and Solomon. It's large. You can see a lot of the bigger cities around and the neighboring nations around. After Solomon, the nation splits in two. And we have the southern kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital, and the northern kingdom of Israel with Samaria as its capital. One of the things that's confusing is that sometimes this northern kingdom is called Israel. Sometimes it's called Samaria. Sometimes it's called Manasseh. It gets lots of names, but there's this separate separate nation that is formed, which is a little sad. The kingdom divides, and then there's big trouble, and the northern kingdom falls to Assyria. About 100 years later, Judah, the southern kingdom, falls to Babylon, and Jerusalem is destroyed, and its population is hauled away to Babylon. But then Babylon falls to Persia, and all of a sudden the king of Persia has this captive nation, and he doesn't want them. He doesn't want to keep them captive any longer. So he says, go back home and rebuild your land, and here's some cash to make it happen. And so they go back. The Judahites go back to Judah. The northern kingdom is completely gone. It's just gone. Eventually, in the 2nd century BC, the Greeks occupy Judah. This is where we get the story of Hanukkah from. Eventually, the Greeks are supplanted by the Romans, and then eventually in a little town called Bethlehem, a child was born who changed the world. And that's basically the entire biblical narrative in like 5 to 7 minutes. When we talk about Isaiah, we're talking about this section right here, which is narrow, but it's also broad. There is so much that happens during the time of Isaiah. And because he is the prophet to the royal house of Judah, he's in the mix of all of it. And so now I want to go and I want to zoom in on that little section there and talk about the history that Isaiah was going through. Are there any questions up to this point before I go through what's going on in Isaiah?
So far, so good?
So far, so good. Everyone's there, can hear me. Okay. Okay. There are the first 40 chapters of Isaiah. And so what we'll be dealing with for probably the next month and a half, it deal with these 4 major events right here. So and this is where I'm going to start getting into names, dates, and places. And do not get overwhelmed. Do not worry about it. I just want you to know that there's a history, and hopefully when we say one of these names or one of these places or one of these dates or one of these events, a couple, next week or a couple of weeks from now, you'll go, oh yeah, I remember hearing something about that. So that's all I want you to get from this. Don't feel like you have to, there's no test, okay? There's no test. So in the 730s BC, Assyria is the big boy on the block. The nation of Assyria is the superpower, and it's on the move, and it becomes a superpower by acquiring other nations and cities. Here we go. In the northern kingdom of Israel, there is a king whose name is Pekah, P-E-K-A-H. And he forms an alliance with the king of the nation of Aram, who's not on this map. But the two of them form an alliance to protect themselves against Assyria. In the ancient world, alliances were everything, particularly when you're going up against the bad boys on the block. The king of Israel, the northern kingdom, and the king of Aram go to the king of Judah, who is Ahaz, and he's going to be very important for a while. For Ahaz's entire reign, Isaiah is his prophet. He's like working. I mean, he's God's prophet to Ahaz. So the king of Israel, king of Aram, go to the king of Judah and say, we want you to join our alliance. And so that we're going to be even stronger and we'll be able to hold Assyria at bay. And we're going to see in the 7th, 8th, and 9th chapters, which we won't get to next week, but we'll get to the following week. This becomes a major point. Because God has an opinion on whether Ahaz should join up with Assyria and Aram. And Isaiah spends several chapters trying to tell him what God wants him to do. What Ahaz does, regardless of what God tells him to do, we'll get to that, is he plays some political jujitsu, and instead of joining with Israel and with Aram, Ahaz joins an alliance with Assyria. So he probably makes the safest move. He's going to join forces with the big boy on the block. And what ends up happening is in 721, with Assyria on to the north and to the east, and Judah to the south and to the west, Israel falls and is utterly destroyed, and is never reconstituted during the ancient world. I mean, it eventually will again become Israel in modern days, but it wasn't back then. The people who live here eventually get to be known as Samaritans. You might have heard of them before. So the fall of Israel is the biggest biblical event that you may never have heard of. It is groundbreaking, although my guess is probably like 97% of Christians in America, if you ask them, who did Israel fall to, probably couldn't tell you. But it's pretty major. Ahaz, after this act of political jujitsu, dies. He is succeeded by King Hezekiah, who becomes another major figure in the book of Isaiah, because then Isaiah becomes his court prophet. The king of Assyria, Sargon II, he dies, and he is succeeded by King Sennacherib. With all of the royal throne swapping, Hezekiah sees an opportunity. He decides to ditch Assyria. Judah decides to cut ties with Assyria. Not only did they have ties, but when you had ties to a larger country, you paid them money. So they would have been, Hezekiah would have been writing a large check to Sennacherib every year. And eventually Hezekiah thought, we could have that money. We won't pay our bills. I'm sure Sennacherib won't notice. This also becomes something of a theme, because this is not the last time this happens. They always think that some king is going to overlook the fact that they're not getting checks anymore. And quite frankly, they never do. If you don't believe them, you can try not paying your phone bill and see if someone notices, right? So Sennacherib notices, and towards the very, very end of the 8th century, the Assyrians lay siege to Jerusalem. So they come and they surround Jerusalem. And do I have this here? Okay. Sennacherib, there's a ancient document written into I believe it's it's a large clay stele. And he says, Hezekiah, I made him a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. The thing is, and he's obviously taunting Hezekiah here, is that for all of the military power that Assyria had at its fingertips, and for as much as they, caged in Jerusalem and no one was going in and no one was going out, no one went in. Assyria never breached the walls of Jerusalem. And it's kind of one of these like incredible historical biblical miracles. Like, there is no way Assyria should have been held at bay. There's an interesting article, and I'll just put this up. You can write the title down if you want, or you can come back to it later. This is a Jewish news magazine. Haaretz, that how mice may have saved Jerusalem 2,700 years ago from the Assyrians. Basically, the theory is that the way that Jerusalem and Hezekiah were saved was because of a plague that struck the Assyrians, and who the people living in Judah would have obviously seen as a sign of providence and protection from God. The Bible tells us that the Assyrians were held off. It doesn't tell us exactly how, but it's an interesting theory, and it's an interesting article if you have a few moments. So the fact that Assyria doesn't breach the walls may have been a harbinger of what was to come, for the Assyria has reached basically the zenith. From here on out, it's basically downhill. Sennacherib would be assassinated not long after this. After this assassination, they would eventually conquer and control Egypt, but it was sort of too little, too late. It was probably not because Assyria was too powerful. It was probably because Egypt was in a very weak moment. It did make Assyria the largest nation in the world when it acquired Egypt. But eventually a new pharaoh arose who kicked Assyria out. The Assyrian city of Nineveh, which is in modern day Iraq, fell to Babylon, and it became the Babylonian city of Nineveh. The Assyrian army retreated west, and it was defeated in 609 by the Babylonians, ending the Assyrian Empire. That's it for them. And with the sunset of the Assyrians, the sun rises on Babylon, and they are the new king on the block. In 605, Babylon defeats Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, which you may remember from like a history class a long time ago. Before that, Egypt had installed their own leader over Judah. They didn't take quite full control, but they exerted really strong political influence over Judah. And so they installed their own king. And then once Egypt was defeated, they dump Egypt and go to Babylon. So they align themselves again, just like Ahaz had aligned himself with Assyria. Jehoiakim, the new king, aligns himself with Babylon. And then Jehoiakim decides again, well, what would it be like if I didn't have to send this big check to Babylon? Things would be a lot rosier around here, and they probably won't notice. And they noticed. Before Jehoiakim could suffer the consequences, he dies of natural means. And then his son, Jehoiachin, faces the wrath of Babylon. They come in, Babylon then installs their own king, King Zedekiah, who again becomes a major figure in the prophet Isaiah, because now Isaiah is his court prophet. And Zedekiah then faces major pressure from the people to dump Babylon, saying that if we stop paying Babylon, perhaps they won't notice again. And of course, they always notice. And so this is when Babylon sends Nebuchadnezzar to go, and they surround Jerusalem. They destroy it, and they destroy the temple. They destroy the walls around the city, the palace. They take a huge number of the populace of Jerusalem, and they take them off to Babylon to be slaves. People who were poor, they didn't really care about, and so they left them behind in the rubble after assaulting the fields, and they had a terrible existence of famine for at least a decade. 70 years after Babylon had taken control of Jerusalem and its populace, Babylon is defeated by the Persians, and King Cyrus of Persia tells the Judahites who are there in Babylon that they're welcome to go home, and here's a pot of money to do it. And so that is what Isaiah is dealing with. What I talked about for the last 10 minutes is we're going to see every one of those political situations show up in Isaiah. And if you notice that there's an arc to the story, things will get bad and bad and bad and then worse, and then things get better, which is what it's also the arc of Isaiah. Isaiah, we're going to see, is going to foretell the horrible things that are about to befall Israel and then Judah. He's going to say not only is he going to have some opinions on how things should run, and no one's going to follow his opinion. And so that's partly why things go awry. But he's also going to say that Judah is also not minding its relationship with God. It has forgotten who it is. And because of that, bad things are on the horizon. But as we get to the end of Isaiah, and I forget who it was that said Isaiah 44 was like their favorite chapter. The end of Isaiah, right after the destruction of Babylon, Isaiah never gets to, and everyone comes back and has a good time. Isaiah gets to the point where everything falls apart, and he says, everything has fallen apart, but things are going to get better. And so the whole end of Isaiah is this beautiful love poem of hope and telling God's people that things are looking up because God is indeed on our side. But he doesn't get to that hope cheaply. He gets to it by going through all of the horrible things before it. All right, that might be all. So before I end the slide, next week we're going to do chapters 1 through 6. If you are interested in some homework, again, there's no test, there's no quiz, there's no grades, but if you are interested, you could take the time and read through chapters 1 to 6. If you do that, perhaps you might circle a couple places where you have a question or where you find something that's interesting or that either makes a lot of sense or doesn't make any sense at all. And we can talk about that next week.